Um, what we're talking about today is obviously what you're leading up to, and that is your black belt grading. And I know you're going for different ranks. So Mr. Faraboy's wanted me to just, some of you have heard a bit of my history, but that's okay, you can hear it again and give you an idea of where I started and came from and the lessons I learned along the way, and hopefully some of those lessons you can relate to, and if you haven't already, you probably will eventually. But I started with judo. Judo was about the only thing we had available to us in Australia when I started martial arts, and that was in, well, 1961. So long ago. It was, judo was everywhere, and I started learning from Nunawading. Nunawading was like a suburb of Melbourne. There was a policeman there teaching judo, and a neighbour that moved into a house opposite where I lived was disappearing. I asked where he was going, and he told me he was going to a judo school. And I ended up going along with him and getting involved in judo, and it was fascinating. I already had an interest, and I've said this in a lot of interviews with martial arts, because they literally would put ads on the back of comic books about judo, for one. And it was very mystical, you know, it had a real mystical lure to it, with the type of things that you were able to do with multiple assailants. But as I've always said too, once you start learning something like judo, you realize it's not quite as easy as the ads make out. It takes a lot of work. And judo demands quite a deal of strength in that in the initial stages until you get technically very, very proficient. And I was very, very skinny. I was very short when I was 11 years of age, and I just became cannon fodder for the older brown belts. And I still remember one brown belt in particular just chucking me from one end of the dojo to the other. You know, I was literally like a cartoon character, you know, wham, wham, wham. Which is interesting, the first lesson's interesting that I remember that, because again, I was an 11-year-old kid, and he was, you know, a teenager, but still late teens. And it's funny that you remember, and what you remember though is the fact that in that situation, you start to question why you're there, because just to be, as I said, cannon fodder for some older, more experienced brown belt leads you to ask, well, what's the point? And I think this is one lesson already that you will be finding out. That's why when we do grappling classes, you know, I always try and stress to you to limit your techniques and everything to the ability of the person you're training with. Because if you are that much better technically or physically stronger or heavier and everything else, the obvious thing is that you could dominate that person in a lot of instances. And again, what's the point? Even if there's a point for you and you feel good and you get your ego stroked because you're tapping somebody out, you know, 15 times, you know, the good thing to ask is, well, who am I actually tapping out and what is their ability? You know, if you really want to check your ego, then wrestle with somebody of equal ability or even better, see how you go, and also see what it feels like when you get tapped out 10 to 15 times. And so the big thing that I got from that I still remember today, and remember we're talking, you know, nearly 50 years ago, it's a good thing to pass on the obligation, or one of the obligations that I think you have as a higher rank when you wear that black belt. You know, the ego is one of the most rampant, sort of uncontrollable things that we have, you know, within us. And it's so important to put a handle on that and put a control on that, and as I said, to live up to the obligations of you being a senior student and being a higher ranked student, and especially a black belt. I mean, your job really is to look after the younger ones. And when I say younger, that has nothing to do with age. It has to do with the ability and the length of training and everything else of those students under you. And you know, I encourage you to always be aware of that. I've had in my training, training with people like Benny the Jet, Sensei Benny Yokides, for example. I started training with Sensei Ben back in 1979. Used to go to his brother's gym in Mission Hills and spar with Benny in a little gym in an old tin shed out the back of his brother Arnold's house before they had the Jet Center. But sparring, even then with him, I still am well aware to this day that at any time Benny could have, cleaned the floor with me, and yet not once did he do that. We always trained hard and he expected you to train at 100%. But I never got knocked out. I never got, knocked to the floor with the wind knocked out of me. Sure, I got stung a little bit. But I always appreciated that control and that control of the ego, that at no time did Benny feel that he had to prove to me that he's Benny the Jet and he's a world champion and this is what I can do. I think that latent ability that we can have as higher ranks and everything is far more advanced when we can keep it just simmering below the surface and put a real control on it, and be an inspiration to those under you, inspiration by the way you conduct yourself, not by the amount of pain you can inflict, or how dominant you can be over them physically, or even, too commanding and too demanding mentally with verbal sort of dominance. So that was the first thing. And again, I'm bringing that up because of my time as an 11-year-old. I would have been far happier and far more satisfied had that brown belt sort of been a little more helpful, been a bit more instructive, allowed me to sit and watch while he sparred maybe black belts or other brown belts. That would have been a better lesson for me than, again, to be that cartoon character going from one end of the dojo to the other. So just keep that in mind, as one thing that really is all-encompassing in the meaning of a black belt. I did a lot of research, and I'm jumping around here, but I used to like reading about Zen, Zen Buddhism, not because I wanted it as a religion as such, because I was brought up Church of England, we call it in Australia, Anglican, but I love the Zen attitude with how it pertained to the martial arts. And one of my favorite books was a book called Zen and Japanese Culture by D.T. Suzuki. And he was a wonderful writer because he could write in a way that was so easy to read. It wasn't above your head, it wasn't, kind of written in a fashion and made it very hard for you to comprehend what the message was. But one of the things I really liked about this Zen attitude to martial arts was, for me way back, the analogy of the modern day sort of martial artist, or the olden day martial artist, or the samurai, let's say. I'd liken it to a Western gunfighter, where the quick draw, shoot and kill, whoever was fastest, was left alive. And the samurai were the same with Iaido, the use of the sword and their combative abilities. But what I really liked was, when you read about the samurai, was that they seemed to be a lot more rounded as gentlemen, in that part of the training involved ikebana, flower arranging, chano-yu, which is the tea ceremony. I mean, very gentle sort of aspects of developing one's core, and their presence, and basically their gentleness, becoming a gentle man, with the idea of having combative abilities, but really only bringing them to the fore when it became absolutely necessary in a life or death situation. And once again, so that leads me on to the same thing. We as martial artists, we strap on our gis and put our black belts on, and that's when it becomes apparent to each other and to the layperson that we're martial artists. But the obligation doesn't stop there. It's not just when you walk in the dojo and you strap your belt and you get on the floor that you're a martial artist. Your obligation as black belts is to be a martial artist 24 hours a day with how you conduct yourself. And if you come into the class and you carry yourself, you know, with a certain stature and everything, you try hard, you work hard, you get confronted with painful exercises and painful drills, and you spar and you get, you know, pain through that and everything, and you learn to overcome all that, and that's what makes you stronger. The important thing also, though, is what I was talking about before, is how you interact with those weaker and younger than you around you, and how much of a gentleman you can be. And I use that to cover the ladies, of course, as well. And it's important that when we walk out of this dojo that we carry that same feeling, that same air about us, and that same kind of humanity that we're trying to build. I mean, everywhere you look, there's sayings. I know there's inspirational sayings. I notice Master Farab always has sayings. And they're all designed to make you a better person. But for me, that's of such limited use if that better person only exists while we're in this training dojo. I mean, it's, what do we do when we get an aggressive person outside, or somebody cuts us off, or we've got a bad day at work, or we go home, and how do we interact with our partners, whether it's wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, with our children? I mean, that's the important part, I would think, that makes us very well-rounded people. And again, part of the obligation of being black belts. And I think that's very, very important that we consider all of that. I dropped out of frame. So, and again, this is all from my point of view. You know, when I talk these things out, you know, a lot of what I always like to say when I teach seminars, I'm not trying to change anybody with my techniques or what I do. It's what I do, and it's what works for me. It doesn't mean it'll work for you. But at the very least, if it causes us to think a little more introspectively about what we're doing in the arts and why we're doing it, then it serves a good purpose. And as you know, getting back to my story, you know, when I started in judo, I sort of felt that wasn't quite for me, at least not at that age and that size. And another friend that I'd been training with in judo suddenly told me there was a karate school opening up. And at that stage, my only introduction to karate was with this particular friend, John Rowe, who had been learning karate out of one of Masaoyama's books, Kyokushin Karate. And I mean, I was just mesmerized by the pictures in this book, and even by what he was doing at home. You know, in his garage, kicking the bag. He loved trying to break boards and everything. And I thought, wow, this is something else. And I want to point out again, too, that even in retrospect and in hindsight, people still say, well, why did you start training in martial arts? And, you know, you always like to hear stories of getting beaten up as a kid, or tough gangs and all that stuff. That wasn't growing up. You know, I had a wonderful family. And the neighborhood I was in certainly didn't have gangs or anything. The kids were all very physical. I mean, because in Australia, where I lived, it was all bush, as we call it. I mean, you're out there with just railway lines and millions of trees, and you have a little tomahawk. You know, you eco-friendly people won't want to hear that. You know, you go out and chop these trees down in the middle of the bush, and you do all that sort of stuff. And but I forgot the point of what I was trying to say there. But the thing about the
why you started training?
Yeah, training, and not. It wasn't about fighting as such, you know, which is like what a lot of young guys are drawn to, especially after seeing a Bruce Lee movie. For me, it was just like there was just such a mystical lure to the idea of martial arts. Probably started because of Masaoyama's books, you know. And so when John Rowe told me there was a school opening up near where we lived, about 3 miles away, I was like, oh wow, we've got to go. And you know, we went down, and the style was Goju-Ryu, Japanese style of karate. The Grand Master of that particular style was Gogen Yamaguchi, whose nickname was the Cat. It was a 10th degree. And Tino Semerano was the instructor, and Tino was a Hawaiian Filipino, and he'd only just recently come out to Australia and had started up a school, and that's what I was going to have a look at. And all we really saw demonstrated was some one-step sparring, as they call it, and some H-pattern kata, which are called Taikyoka, Joden, Chuden, Geiden. It's just using very basic blocks in an H-pattern form. But I still just remember that day, today, and that was so long ago. You know, I was probably 14 when that happened, so that's 1964. And I just thought, this is what I want to do. And that's why I say it wasn't through fighting or anything. It was just, in hindsight, I honestly believe that that's what I was meant to do with my life, was to be involved in martial arts. And, you know, it's been an incredible journey, as I've often said, because, you know, I'm 58 now and still loving it and still enjoying it and still on the journey. And why I bring even the journey up is that that's such an important thing also for us as martial artists. My experience with a lot of people when they start martial arts is it's all about the black belt. Wow, when I get the black belt, you know, I've made it. Well, you know, as you know, a lot of lay people think there really is only one black belt. You get lower rank colors and then you get black belt, and then guess what? You're a grand master and you can kill anybody, you know? Well, as you probably already realized by now, I've got news for them, you know, it's not that easy. It's really only the beginning. It is only the start. And you realize that when you do get into karate. When I was coming through with Tino and Goju, we were basically instructed that the Q ranks in Japanese, the ranks, you know, from 10th Q all the way up to first Q, followed on by Shodan Ho, which is probationary black belt, and then Shodan. The Q ranks were considered boy ranks. And again, with nothing to do with your age, and not being sexist and just calling them boy ranks, but that's what they call them. But it had to do with where you were in your journey of the martial arts. So you're a boy, whether you were 40 years of age, you know, you were still considered a boy within the dojo until you got to Shodan Ho, probationary black belt, and then Shodan. And Shodan as a first degree black belt, all that really meant was you've shown you're kind of serious enough to really start learning what martial arts is all about. It's not that suddenly you're going to start wearing 50,000 colors and you're going to be Grandmaster Bill Bloggs. It had nothing to do with that. It's like you're still a student of the arts and you've really just started a really serious aspect of your journey in the arts. And that's where it starts as a black belt. And believe me, it'll be that way for first degree and second degree and third degree. It's about the journey, and I've always said it's not about the finding, it's about the journey. Because once you think you've found it, meaning you get the black belt, well, I've learned everything and on this and on that, then it all stops in my mind. I've often said anything that stops still long enough is probably dead. You know, whether it's a plant, a leaf, a branch, a person, it's all about movement. And you need to understand that. Don't be like so, you know, there would be literally, I would say, thousands of people that I've been around and trained with and trained that have got through to black belt only to end their journey because of this attitude that, well, I'm good enough, I know this, and they drop out. And it's sad because, as I said to you, with all the years that I've been training, I just still couldn't be more passionate than I am now about learning more things and adding to my journey and keeping moving. And that's why I say to you, it's, you know, there was a, I mean, I've mentioned this before, there was a guy called Buckminster Fuller wrote a book called The Critical Path. And he talks about, in his book, about a lot of things, but he talks about precession and goal setting and the fact that when you set goals, like in this case, maybe you start martial arts and all you want to do is be, what's your middle ranks? You know, what do you have? Blues, greens?
Blues, browns. You
know, whatever. And kind of you think, it seems so hard that if I could just get to that rank, I'd be happy, I'd really feel like I've achieved something. And and you get to that rank, and suddenly it's never quite as fulfilling as it seemed. And the analogy I always like to give is like when you compete in martial arts. You think, wow, I want to compete, I want to win a trophy. If I could just win, the Woodland Hills Karate Championship, I'd be happy, I wouldn't want any more, I'd be so satisfied. And you train and you train and you train, you enter the tournament and you win it. And suddenly that totally fulfilling dream is just not what it seemed anymore. And so suddenly it's like, wow, there's a Los Angeles tournament on, and I'm using, just examples here. If I could just win that, if I could win this tournament and be the champion of Los Angeles, what else could you want? I'd be totally happy, that's all I want. And you train and train and train, you win that. Suddenly that doesn't seem enough. And on it goes, and you maybe compete in the American, then the ultimate is to become a world champion. But really the reason that Buckminster Fuller goes into that these goals are never quite as fulfilling as they were before you reach them is merely to keep you moving. It's to keep you in motion. So when you get to black belt, well that's okay, but what about second degree black belt? How cool would that be? If I could just get to there, I'd be good enough, I'm this age, whatever, that'll really be an achievement for me. And you get to second degree. Oh, what if I could be a third degree? And the accompanying ranks that go on, whether it's be Sensei Kyoshi, Shihan, there's all these different ranks, at least in Japanese systems, that are tagged on as you achieve higher levels in your different ranks.